Back in 1948, the map of the Middle East was completely redrawn. A single, absolutely pivotal war gave birth to the State of Israel, and at the very same time, created one of the world's most long-lasting refugee crises. This is the story of that conflict, an event whose aftershocks are, without a doubt, still being felt today. So to really get a grip on how this all happened, we're going to walk through it in 4 parts. First, we'll look at the UN's plan to divide the land. Then we'll follow the violence as it explodes into a civil war and then into a full-blown international conflict. And finally, we'll unpack the aftermath, a new map, and a crisis that has really defined the region ever since. All right, so our story really kicks off in late 1947. For decades, this area, Palestine, had been under British control, but the British were on their way out, and the massive problem of what to do with a land that was claimed by both Jewish and Arab communities, well, that whole issue got dropped right in the lap of the brand new United Nations. So, on November 29, 1947, the UN came up with Resolution 181. It was a pretty radical idea. Carve British Mandatory Palestine into 2 new countries. A Jewish state would get 56% of the land, and an Arab state would get 42%. And Jerusalem? Well, it was supposed to be this special international city, run by the UN, belonging to neither side. And the reaction to this plan? It was immediate, and it was completely black and white. The Jewish leadership, they saw it as their best shot at having a state, so they accepted it, calling it the indispensable minimum. But the Arab leadership, they rejected it completely. They argued it was totally unfair to the Arab majority and violated their right to determine their own future. There was just no middle ground. So that UN vote, it didn't solve anything. It was a trigger. While you had Jewish communities celebrating in the streets, that joy was met with strikes, protests, and violent attacks from the Arab side. The very plan that was designed to prevent a war had just kicked one off. And that kicked off the first phase of the conflict. For the next 6 months, while the British were kind of still there but packing their bags, Palestine just plunged into a brutal civil war. It was neighbor against neighbor, Jewish and Arab militias fighting for control. Things just spiraled out of control, and fast. What started as small ambushes and bombings quickly became much more organized. By early 48, you had volunteer armies like the Arab Liberation Army joining the fight. And then came a huge turning point. Arab forces cut off the road to Jerusalem, blockading its 100,000 Jewish residents, which forced the Jewish militias to make a major change in strategy. And that strategic shift was called Plan Dalet. This was the moment the main Jewish militia, the Haganah, went from playing defense to going on the offense. Now, officially, the goal was to secure the territory that the UN had assigned for the Jewish state. But historians still argue about it. Was it just a defensive move, or was it a plan to clear out the Arab population? And this stage of the war was vicious. It wasn't just soldiers fighting anymore. Civilians were right in the middle of it. The massacre of Arab villagers at Deir Yassin created widespread terror. And in retaliation, an attack on a medical convoy headed to Hadassah Hospital killed Jewish doctors and nurses. It was just this awful cycle of violence. Fear became a weapon, and people on both sides started running for their lives. So you've got this brutal civil war hitting its peak. And then, just as the last British soldiers were leaving, everything changes. What had been a local fight was about to explode into a full-scale international war. This is the moment, May 14th, 1948. Literally hours before the British mandate officially ended, David Ben-Gurion stood up in Tel Aviv and declared the independence of the State of Israel. The dream of a Jewish state was suddenly a reality. And almost immediately, the big world powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, recognized it. And the reaction from the Arab world? It was swift and it was massive. The very next morning, the armies of 5 different countries, Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, invaded from all sides. Their goal was simple: destroy the new state of Israel before it could even get on its feet. Now, if you just look at the starting numbers, you'd think the invading armies had this in the bag. They had more soldiers, more equipment, but here's the kicker. Look at how those numbers changed by the end of the war. Israel's forces, now called the IDF, grew like crazy thanks to mass mobilization and some very clever secret arms deals, especially during a couple of UN ceasefires that were supposed to stop the fighting. So after barely surviving that initial invasion, the IDF used those crucial truces to regroup and rearm. And then they went on the attack. Big military operations like Yoav and Hiram, not only pushed back the Arab armies, but also allowed Israel to capture a lot more land than the UN had planned, completely redrawing the proposed map. By the time the fighting finally stopped in 1949, a new reality had been carved into the region. The war left behind a legacy of division and displacement that honestly is still playing out today. The war didn't end with a peace treaty, a final handshake. Instead, they signed these armistice agreements that drew ceasefire lines. These lines became famous as the Green Line. And instead of the 56% of the land the UN proposed, the new state of Israel now controlled 78%. The rest, the West Bank and Gaza, fell into the control of Jordan and Egypt. But the single most devastating human cost of the war was the Palestinian refugee crisis. Around 700,000 Palestinian Arabs, that's more than half of their entire population in the area, either fled or were forced from their homes. They ended up in refugee camps, starting a crisis that is still unresolved today. But at the very same time, another huge population shift was happening. In the years right after the war, a wave of hostility against Jews swept across the Arab world. And as a result, about 700,000 Jews from those countries either fled or were expelled, with most of them moving to Israel. This essentially created a parallel refugee story. And that's why, for Palestinians, 1948 is known as the Nakba, which is Arabic for the catastrophe. It's more than just a word for a lost war. It represents the complete shattering of their society, the loss of their homes, and the start of a new identity as a people in exile. For Israelis, though, that very same conflict is called Milhemet Ha'atzmaut, the War of Independence. This name frames it as a heroic David versus Goliath struggle for their very survival, and the triumphant moment they finally achieved their dream of having their own country. And the human price, it was just staggering on all sides. Israel lost more than 6,000 people, which was about 1% of its entire population at the time. Imagine that. For the Arabs, the numbers are harder to confirm, but estimates run as high as 15,000 dead. It was an incredibly bloody and tragic war for everyone involved. And this really brings us to the heart of it all. How do the results of 1948 still shape everything in the region today? Because the thing is, the war never really ended. The borders drawn in 49, the millions of refugees, and these two powerful, completely opposite stories, one of catastrophe, the other of independence, they aren't just history. They are the living, breathing core of the conflict we still see today.